Let's make a third video about multiplayer in GDevelop. The last two videos covered the basics of multiplayer and making games with it, but there have been a number of patches and updates to the multiplayer system in GDevelop that we're going to talk about in this video. Jumping right into variables. Specifically, which variables are being sent and by who. From the last two videos, you already know about taking ownership of a variable. So to use this in an actual game, it would be something like this, where each player will take control of their own personal score and send that information to the other players. But what we didn't talk about was that it takes ownership of the root variable, which is why these variables are laid out individually. Because if I tried to use a structure, the variable that would be taken is the root variable. So whoever owns the root variable controls all of the other variables in that structure or array. And then there's an action to desync a variable so that it's not being sent to any players at all. And this is useful for a lot of things, like controls in your game, so that each player can set their own individual controls, or for settings like volume, which you can just set up at the beginning of scene. Next are some controls for the multiplayer behavior. Because of the last videos, you already know about taking ownership of an object and desyncing individual behaviors, which is useful for things like the smooth camera behavior. But now there's a new feature for the behavior that gives you a little more control. And that's the action to change the synchronization rate of all of your objects with the multiplayer behavior. So you can use the action object synchronization rate and change it to equal something between 1 and 60. And this is basically the number of times per second that objects send their information to other games with the multiplayer behavior. So if you have something like a card game where you don't need to send information very often, you might be able to set your synchronization rate down to 1. Or, if you have something like an FPS game that requires more up-to-date timing, you can set it to 60 per second. But by default, it's set to 30. And this action will only apply to the game that it's set on, so make sure it's set at the beginning of scene for all of the games. Now let's talk about the new templates in the engine. There are a bunch of premium and free examples in the engine that you can open up and either learn from or build off of to make your own multiplayer game. And they're all set up a little differently, so you know the different options for creating multiplayer games. So for example, in the physics-based bounce puzzle game, there are two different player objects for player 1 and player 2, and the ownership is set in the behavior inside the object, which is a rigid way to build your game, but totally valid if you only have a couple of players. And then there's Arrow Fight, where there are multiple instances of the same object already placed in the game scene, and you use an ID variable to decide which player owns which instance of the object. And then lastly, there's the Rage Jump game, where there's no player object in the scene to begin with, and instead, when each player joins the game, they create an instance of the player object in their game and take ownership of it, and then the multiplayer behavior spawns that player in the other games. Which is probably the most flexible setup, and is one of the best options for games when players are constantly going to be joining and leaving. Which leads us to our next new feature, players joining mid-game, or dropping out. So in your game dashboard, in the multiplayer settings, there's a new checkbox for allow players to join after the game has started. And this is on by default, but if your game is set up in a way that it can't really handle players joining mid-game, you can turn this off and be sure to save it. Then once a lobby game has started, nobody else can join. But if you do want players to be able to join mid-game, there are some new conditions that let you know when they've joined your game. So there's the player has joined condition, where you can use the player number to check if a specific player has joined. But there's also any player has joined. So you can check if any player has joined your game and then respond accordingly, by either spawning new enemies or adjusting the game in some way to compensate for new players. And there's also conditions for if a player has left. And again, you can use the player number, or check if any player has left. Those features are useful for other players if they join or leave the game. But what about the host? Now there's a feature for host migration that happens automatically. So if the host leaves a game, then the remaining player with the lowest ping automatically becomes the new host of the game. Because this process could take a couple of seconds and cause some problems in your game, there's a condition to check if the host is currently migrating. Then you can use that to pause your game to prevent the players from doing anything while the host is migrating. But if your specific game is going to have trouble with the host migrating, in a game where, for example, the host is the one who has the game world saved on their computer, then you can use the action to configure lobby game to end when the host leaves, at the beginning of scene for all of the games. If you want to see the first 2 videos on multiplayer in GDevelop, then click on one of these videos.